Thank you so much for everyone for being here. Helen, thank you so much for doing this tournament with me. You are one of the best debaters that I've ever seen, and it means a lot that you did my last nationals with me. Thank you for writing this beautiful, beautiful case. It's super interesting, and I'm really excited that we get to debate this. To all the judges, thank you for taking your time out and coming to judge this tournament. That has been an awesome judge pool, and I'm really grateful for the fact that all of you all are here. Cam and Shyla, thank you guys for being here. You've been good friends over the last few years. We've opted a lot of your cases, gobbed on you guys a lot, and had a lot of good rounds. As for hoping for another good round for us. Thank you for recording this round. To Georgetown for hosting a very good nationals, and for the rest of the Chicago team for being here to support us and to generally being awesome people. That being said, do you guys mind if I sit? That's good. All right. Is anyone not ready? Quickly, some framing on top. The primary interest of the CCP in 1949 is stable economic growth for the peasant class. Remember, these peasants served as the main power base for the CCP's right to power, fighting against the Japanese Imperial Army and the Chinese Nationalist Forces. They did this because the CCP promised redistributive economic policies that would allow them to escape poverty and access larger shares of gains from their labor. The absence of peasant support would risk either mass revolt against the CCP or fracturing within the CCP, either of which would destroy the party's chance of successfully transitioning into a stable government. Remember, the CCP does not yet have a strong apparatus of state control or oppression. In the short term, they are reliant on buy-in from their power base to maintain control. Thus, as both sides of the House pivot their economies to light or heavy industry, the round will be decided by which pivot helps the peasants the most. Our first argument is that transitioning to light industry will be more feasible than transitioning to heavy industry. Subpoint A. Heavy industry requires heavy investment. Heavy industry requires more startup investment than light industry. The manufacturing plants, energy infrastructure, and human capital requirements are all more complex and so cost more. Moreover, these investments often have to run for a longer time frame before the factory makes a profit. However, the newly established CCP lacks a strong economic base. Most of the farmers are subsistence workers making low-value goods like rice. They are very difficult to tax because the very little wealth is in form of cash and their assets have low to zero value. Much of the urban infrastructure of China was destroyed either during World War II or during the Civil War, so the cities will not be able to provide a large tax base either. Thus, the CCP will not be able to invest in heavy industry and scale. This will create internal dispute within the party as more politically powerful members advocate to keep resources in their region, leaving other regions destitute. This happens less with light industry as A. Smaller investments can be spread around more easily and light industries make profits faster, allowing their money to be reinvested across China within a short time frame. The weighing is simple. If the CCP leaves behind certain regions due to budget constraints, there is a very high risk of revolt or internal party fracturing, with both of which prevent any long-term benefit to China. Subpoint B. Heavy industry requires heavy importing. China will have to import raw materials to stand up heavy industry. China's oil wells and metal mines were prime targets of warfare, leaving them inoperable. Even if China had bought raw materials, it lacks capabilities to refine petroleum or ore at scale, forcing them to turn to international markets. Western countries entering the Cold War will be very unwilling to support a communist government in China, so your only trading partner will be the USSR. The implication of this is that importing heavy industry destroys China's currency in the short term. China will be imposing massive amounts of goods, but will not ready to export anything until heavy industry is up and running, created a net trade inflow. This means that China will have to send huge volumes of its currency outside its borders to pay for the goods that it is purchasing. China's domestic economy is not strong enough to support funding those imports or bonds, so China will have to print fiat currency in order to pay for those goods, leading to domestic inflation. In comparison, the light industry requires a small quantity of raw materials and a greater diversity of raw materials and has a faster turnaround by exporting those goods. This ensures that you have less of a net export deficit and less inflation. Rapid inflation will wash away any economic gains for the peasant class. The success of transition is a higher consideration than the long-term benefits. Our second argument is that even if the transition succeeds, a light industry economy is better for the Chinese state. Subpoint A. Light industry is more economically diverse and agile. Light industry requires concentrations of investments in factories, factors of production, and human capital, so the type of goods produced in light industrial environments will necessarily be more diverse. When you are making textiles, you can easily repurpose a mill into making clothing, sheets, or blankets, where it is much harder to retrofit a car manufacturing or a steel manufacturing plant into one that makes trains. Notably, it is the party's interest to create this diversity because spread out stable wealth creation is a silver bullet for short-term economic stability. So it is capacity and not incentive that controls the diversity of China's economic output. The structural diversity of light industry has three impacts. Firstly, increased resiliency to international demand. Western powers are very likely to try and subsidize competition for your exports to weaken and destabilize a communist economy. A light industry economy can more easily pivot, avoiding that competition. Second, increased resiliency to domestic demand. As peasants gain more economic freedom, their consumer preferences are likely to evolve rapidly. A light industrial economy is better positioned to match those needs as they evolve. Finally, increased proximity to innovation. When you have multiple smaller factories, lower level workers, and officials are more powered to suggest changes and improvements. Over time, the party can spread those improvements across all of China, leading to substantial gains. Subpoint B, light industry better aligns political incentives. The consolidation of heavy industry will create powerful bureaucratic incentives within the party, causing individual incentives to misalign within the goals of the CCP. Now, there is a specific factory whose production is critical to the economy of a province, region, or town. The CCP member in charge of that factory gains an outsized amount of political power both locally and nationally. This enables them to misrepresent production numbers, embezzle value, or cover up scandals that arise under their purview. Notably, the party will always be hesitant to check back against these individuals, as doing so may inhibit their economic productivity of their heavy industry plants, which are more likely to be too big to fail. Moreover, heavy industry projects are more technically complex, making them harder to audit and expected to run at a loss in the short term, making it very easy for officials to hide behind bad practices behind narratives such as making an investment for the future. Notably, this can still happen with light industry, but the smaller scale, increased diversity, limited complexity, and the expectations of positive growth make it substantially less likely, both because people will be more willing to check back against corrupt officials and because enforcement creates deterrence against corruption in the first place. The weighing is simple. Even if the CCP wants to spread wealth to the peasantry, individual officials may be misaligned with party goals. Corruption diverts wealth away from the working class, decreasing trust in the CCP government and increasing likelihood of instability and state collapse. Subpoint C. Even if heavy industry works, peasants see less economic benefit. Heavy industry sees a higher concentration of labor substitution by machinery than light industry does. If you're smelting metal, a furnace must do a lot of the work as opposed to the laborer. On the other hand, in light industry, automation is less possible and less mandatory, ensuring a greater dependency on workers. Thus, heavy industry is characterized by a smaller number of higher paying jobs of people with the skills to work heavy machinery, whereas light industry is able to employ a larger number of relatively unskilled people. This ensures that economic gains of light industry are spread more widely. Remember that in 1949, China has a population of 500 million, many of whom had their homes, farms, and livelihoods destroyed by World War II. They are presently unemployed and reliant on state support. These people have the greatest threat to the stability of the CCP. If the party does not follow through on its promises to grant them a better economic conditions, they are likely to support another faction that will. Now, it is unlikely that either side on the House can achieve full structural employment with our policies, but light industry will employ more people across different skill sets and provide hope to every worker in China. 3 reasons why. Firstly, light industry employs more people. Secondly, it is easier to train or retrain workers for light industry jobs. Thirdly, because light industry produces profit faster than heavy industry, the state will have more capital to spend on job training, education, and even welfare services like food aid, hospitals, and housing programs in the short run. The impact is not just practical, it also resonates through government messaging. Persuading a rice farmer that he can become an airplane manufacturer is very difficult, resulting in that person losing faith in the CCP government. On the other hand, if you offer them a variety of opportunities with lower barriers to entry, they are far more likely to go along with the party's agenda, allowing for short-term stability to translate to economic success. A few pieces of weighing on this. Firstly, on uniqueness. Note that young men are going to be employed on either side of the house in the agriculture or the service sector. We think that employing and educating the least well-off provides the most social benefit, but also stimulates growth by putting capital into new hands. Second, when women and elderly cannot find work, this creates huge financial pressures on families to subsidize their consumption, meaning that one breadwinner now provides for 3 generations. This means that when the primary owner from the family gets injured or can no longer work, the entire family falls into poverty. Third, unemployment of the historically marginalized increases the possibility of political unrest and economic inequality. Poor working conditions and job instability, even among the privileged, further increase the likelihood of protest and demonstration, undercutting the CCP's political control. Fourth, unemployment means that capital is largely concentrated in the hands of the few, further exacerbating supply-demand gaps, as most individuals cannot afford to purchase basic goods, meaning that things like cars become extreme luxuries. For all of these reasons, we're very proud to propose.
Here, thank the Prime Minister for the opening remarks and call upon the Leader of the Opposition to open the Opposition Senate round.
My job for this, yes.
I'm also going to give pleasantries. I decided that I was going to go to this tournament on Monday. I was not planning. I've talked all year about how I didn't want to come to nests. The only reason that I am at this tournament is because of Cam. You literally asked me, are you willing to go with anybody else? I said, absolutely not. I genuinely only am at this tournament for you. I'm honored to, whatever round will end up being your last round, to be there by your side. You're an amazing partner, and I love you so much. Thank you to Deb. I was scared you would run something sweaty and boring. This is actually very cool, and also obviously meaningfully important, so I'm happy that you did it. I think this is going to be a very fun round. And also, Helen, I've never debated you before, but I've heard really good things about you, so I'm actually really excited to have this round. And finally, thank you to the judges. I'm excited, and thank you to Music for running this round, and to Georgetown for running the next. Off on. Starting over overview, I think the trading partners and you are in a similar space. I think your trading partners are probably going to be other communist countries. I think there are political reasons why more of the capitalist countries are not going to trade with you, given that they want to, not support the communists or whatever. Given that, then your main trading partner is going to be the USSR. The thing is, the USSR does not have a leisure class in order to buy consumer goods. They are in an economic crisis. Because they were the first communist group and they spent a lot of money in it, and they're quite literally in a famine. This means they don't have a leisure class to be able to buy any of these textiles or these other luxury goods that they would be exporting on Gov. So it's incredibly unclear who would actually end up buying these goods whatsoever in the first place. But additionally, the trading part, in order to do this exportation, would also need a lot of new construction, right? You would need to be able to you need steel in order to build these factories. You need roads in order to build travel things to the ports, and you also need ports and ships in order to move stuff to the USSR, because you're probably trying to get everything from the coastal cities, the major coastal cities in China, to the major cities in Russia or Soviet Union, which is west side of Russia now, right? That means then you need ships that are able to go a very long distance, you need lots of ports, you need roads, and you need lots of factories. This requires infrastructure, which they literally don't have right now, but you need heavy industry to actually be able to build that. Second thing is on the post-war context. A lot of roads, etc. were destroyed. They also said a lot of the urban factories were destroyed. Even before this, China's development was highly skewed. Coastal cities were much more developed than huge inner rural areas. You need even development, and you need to be able to develop things in order to actually do this trade in the first place, or to do any sort of economic development in the first place. Now let's go to our first argument, which is going to be on the development of the economy, specifically starting with infrastructure development. Your country does not have much infrastructure. Roads were destroyed per the overview, and also per the overview, you don't have the ports, roads, etc. You need the infrastructure. Why is this? First of all, it helps you trade. The USSR cannot trade with you without the infrastructure to import and export goods. If they cannot physically get ships from coastal cities up in North Russia all the way down to the eastern side of China, you literally cannot get any sort of trade happening whatsoever. So given that you need to have lots of ports and ships to be able to handle this, and also you need roads to be able to move stuff more inwards into the country, you need to have the infrastructure. The USSR cannot trade with you in your current state because you don't have infrastructure to handle any trade. On either side, though, I think trade is likely going to be minimal for the reason that we explained in the overview. That is because of the USSR famine and economic crisis, they're not having a leisure class that's going to buy any of these textiles. I also think that the government side does not have the capacity to export goods in any way. If they do not have these ports, they cannot move stuff to the coastal cities, etc. What does this mean then? I think the trade actually goes to off, because in the long run, you as a CCP probably believe that the communists are going to win. You believe that you're going to be able to trade with more countries in the future because there's going to be more communist countries. Additionally, you also believe that you're going to be able to trade with the USSR in the future once they fix their problem. Why is this so important? You want to build the infrastructure now so that you're able to do the trade when you actually get to the point that you can start trading with other communist countries, and with the additional communist countries going to be created, in the long term it's going to be better for all, because if you don't have the infrastructure to build to have any of these things, you cannot have any trade in the first place. You're not going to be able to get the infrastructure on Gov because part of the overview, nobody's going to trade with you, which means you're not going to get the money to later switch into building the infrastructure, and once you switch, it's going to be too late because you don't have it. It's going to take a lot of time. Versus on our side, you're able to build the infrastructure, and then you're able to do the exportation once the communists win. Secondly, on war readiness, I think you're able to make weapons, roads, etc. to prepare for the capitalist aggression. That is, you need to be able to move things within the cities, move to especially different areas of China. You want to have the ability to do that. But also, I just think it's going to help you move products around. You're doing light machinery. You literally need to move raw materials around. If I can't move food from the more rural areas into the processing plant that is in an entirely different city, I'm simply completely unable to do that if I do not have the infrastructure to do so, given that these roads were literally destroyed for that. Why do we help you get more infrastructure? First of all, we literally produce the materials, and we also, because we produce the materials, they're going to the factories and allow us to produce these things in the future. But second of all, I just don't think anybody else is going to help us produce the materials they need because of the framing that we give at above. But also, even if they do help us produce the material, or even if they do help us produce materials, we can't even get them in the country because we don't have that infrastructure level of exportation. Second thing under this whole argument is going to be on the labor force. I think our labor force is unskilled right now. They're much better prepared for construction and heavy industry. They do a lot of assertions that it's much easier to do light industry than heavy industry as an unskilled worker. I think that is incredibly false. At best, this is just mere assertions on their side. You should not vote on this whatsoever. But I think that it's easier to do heavy machinery. That is, I think it is easier to literally move heavy things around and cut things and put things together than to do highly specialized sewing techniques for multiple hours a day. I think that these things are at best non-unique and just mere assertions that depend on the circumstance, but outwards, I think it's easier to just move things around than to do highly specialized techniques, especially if you're not that literate of a country. Third of all, I think that the people who who are in the labor force are going to be unmotivated for producing goods for exports compared to other types of goods. That is, the people who are in this country, who will be doing the majority of this unskilled labor, are people who literally, who are part of the class that fought to get the CCP elected or not elected, but like put in power in the first place. That means then that given that they have this government in order to help them, if this government is not doing anything that's going to help them, but instead is producing goods that is going to go to upper class people in different countries that are not China, the Chinese peasants are not going to want to work in these factories in the first place. They're likely not going to, so you're not going to have the labor force that you need, first of all, and second of all, your labor force is likely going to spend more time organizing. That's going to be our second independent point. Second independent point is on the political benefits. Let's start with an overview. I think catering consumer goods over producing construction materials, transit through cars and gas, etc., are going to have pragmatic effects on the populace, but also bad optics. Why bad optics? Because you look less communist, because you're producing consumer lifestyle goods, and because it looks like you were uninvesting in the welfare of the people, because you're focusing on getting trade to other countries, upper class in other countries, rather than people in your own country, but also you just look less communist because you're literally engaging in like this capitalist aesthetic of like producing luxury goods like textiles for other people. I think we can cross-apply everything that we say above as to why, first of all, your people simply do not need these goods. They're unable to even afford them in the first place, but also they just don't necessarily need them, but second of all, yeah, they can afford them. Okay. The second thing under this is that the disempowered farming classes are going to lead the revolution. You need to prove that you're serious about helping out all of China to be lifted from poverty. You need to provide jobs, new housing, roads, cars, etc. travel, and cars to travel on these roads in order to distribute the goods, to get steel, to do things like build schools and hospitals and factories, etc. If you cannot do that on the because you do not have this infrastructure in the first place, you're going to anger the peasants. But second of all, I think uniting the nation with roads is going to hugely help unite the nation politically and culturally, because right now you have in the status quo, you have very little movement of people, goods, info, etc. So you need roads in order to create unity in a nation, given that China is so big and has so many different ethnic groups, and has like people from so many different like lived experiences, which means first of all you decrease the likelihood of territory splits, that is like different parts of China split off into different territories because they have no sense of like a united political identity. Second of all, you solidify your ability to roll out the army if needed to fight against the capitalists or fight against like peasants who are rising up again or whatever. And third of all, you need an ability to check on the productivity of factories, have info access, all check back on the corruption that they discuss in the government, because on their side it's impossible to get officials out into rural areas to check on their production because you do not have the roads that go from the cities to the rural areas. Third thing under this is you're going to be turning your back on them in two ways. The first way is that they won't have the money to buy these goods, not to mention you won't be able to move the goods to them, so none of the people who fought for the revolution are actually going to benefit from a consumer good-oriented economy. The destruction of these groups is going to lead to uprisings and new conflict. The post-conflict state is super fragile and likely to break apart again. But the second thing is that producing essentials first corrects for historical gaps in development between rural and urban coastal areas. So turning your back on the ideology, you convince them to go on is far important. Ideology is very important. So like campaign for war on the basis of more literacy, more education, ideological study for all people. I also just think like in the environment of like a post-revolutionary state, the people are very likely to revolutionize again unless you make them happy because they already have the revolutionary spirit within them. Let's go on, case. I think literally most of this is just simply cross-applied. I think that the first argument is not more feasible if you literally do not have the steel to build these factories. This is existential because if they cannot build any of the factories they're talking about on Gov, you can never do light machinery, so they don't win. On the second argument, productivity and innovation, I don't think you can innovate when you don't have resources. I think the political incentives are linked to stronger because we talk about like the actual people who are likely to rise up.
Thank you, Leader of the Opposition, for remarks, and call upon the member of governments to continue the government side of the case.
Off case, on case.
And it docked out for a second.
Oh, pleasantries.
bad at giving pleasantries because I'm usually pretty nervous, but thank you, Rohan, so much for partnering with me in your last APDA tournament of your senior year. It really means a lot. You've been a really good mentor. He was, I think, my first varsity partner other than Pro-Ams my first year, so it's kind of a full circle moment to be here today. Congrats on everything you've achieved. You're like such a role model in APDA and in BP. You deserve all the success you got yesterday, 10th speaker. That's really amazing, and I'm really, really proud of you. Thank you so much to Side Op for a great op, engaging with the case in a charitable and wonderful way. I've also never hit you before, but it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for the judges for judging. Sometimes a thankless task, but we really do appreciate it. Thank you, Georgetown, for hosting as well. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. They give you a lot of assertions. They tell you you're not going to have infrastructure and that prices are going to increase, but note that these are assertions and they need warrants for you to be able to buy them. Let's start with the fact that they tell you that you're going to not have other countries to trade with and that the Soviet Union is going to be poor. Two responses to this. First is that the Soviet Union at this specific time has huge links to other Soviet countries. They're the unique leader in global communism. That means that all other countries are likely going to be trading with them. But secondarily, as we tell you in construct, given that the Soviet Union is the leader in exporting heavy industry, that means all countries with the demand for heavy industry are likely turning to the Soviet Union, giving them their money. Third, as we know empirically, the Soviet Union was a huge leader in the tech industry. That's why the things like the Cold War happens. They have large amounts of technological innovation, meaning that these are final products that they're able to sell to other countries. What then do we say? I think it's quite clear that the Soviet Union actually prefers to invest in light industry. Why is it the case? Russia was a developed country before World War II, right? They have both light and heavy industry capabilities. However, the Russian military-industrial complex, post-global conflicts, means that their economy could be more easily transitioned toward heavy industry, as factories that made like tanks and planes could be more easily used to make vehicles and machinery post-conflicts. Thus, Russia is presently overproducing heavy industry and underproducing light industry. That then means if China chooses to compete with Russia in their comparative advantage, the CCP reduces demand and prices for Russian goods. This is directly seen as a threat to Khrushchev and triggers all the bad impacts they talk about on their side of the house. But furthermore, we would tell you that the USSR will always privilege its domestic economic interests over its foreign policy in Asia because a strong economy is necessary for stabilizing Eastern Europe, a far more critical region for the Soviets. So when we tell you that the Soviet Union is willing to help you, willing to invest in you, this is contingent on you not outcompeting them in the same industry that they create. The fear of Chinese competition, though, as we would tell you, would cause Soviets to withhold all heavy industry technologies and input factors, therefore making it impossible to import the kinds of steel and chemicals that they talk about on their side of the house. Note that the only way China would be able to set up heavy industry is if they have some sort of blueprint to follow, some sort of infrastructure to be able to lean on. That doesn't occur because your main trading partner pours out. On Gov, you can always import heavy industry from the Soviets for cheap, particularly if you're subsidizing and giving them the kinds of light industry goods that they need on their side of the house. They have huge soft power reasons to want to be able to do so since they don't have many allies on the global stage, and global trade will help them as well. The weighing is quite simple, right? Like if Russia does not give China the technology, they will pivot, and the pivot to an industrial economy is always going to fail. The next thing they talk about is on infrastructure. They say infrastructure is necessary. They don't prove why heavy industry means that infrastructure is actually going to be created. First, we would tell you that the kinds of transportation that is needed for heavy industry is impossible on their side of the house, given that we tell you that heavy industry is created in largely scattered rural areas. These are large factories, large production plants. You don't need a lot of transport to go from place to place. Comparatively, we would tell you that light industry requires infrastructure, right? Because they need efficient financial, transportation, and education infrastructure for you to import raw materials, inputs from like place to place, from factory to factory, and to deliver it across the entire country, whereas heavy industry exists in decentralized rural areas. But the second thing I would say under this is that like uniquely it's hard to import heavy industry abroad as well, given the like weight of it, given the like that this largely looks like things like steels and machinery and weapons, because A, they take a long time to create, so the kinds of infrastructure you're going to make is probably not going to realize until tens or 50s of years later. But secondarily, because these things are heavy, because they're difficult and expensive to transport, it's unlikely the infrastructure is actually going to be conducive for any kind of like future trade that you need to do. But the third thing that we would tell you is that like the Silk grow that China, and like the connections that China have made are uniquely positioned for you to import cheap light industry goods, given that this is the kind of connections that they've made in the past and the kinds of connections that they can lead on in the future. That then means we actually get solvency because China only has the incentive to create infrastructure that they need economically on our side of the house. But the second thing that we would tell you under this is on China's comparative advantage in light industry, right? We would tell you that China has a large population, which allows you to subsidize the labor force needed for mass production, whereas they don't have the kinds of extensive raw materials you need for heavy industry. The second thing we would tell you that labor costs are likely cheap, given the large labor force that has been unemployed for a large amount of time. And the third thing is that China uniquely has the kind of land mass and distribution and ecological resources needed for light industry. This looks like things like natural resources like silk or rice or all of the intermediary goods you need, whereas they don't have the kinds of chemical and steel you need. That then means they don't engage when we tell you in case that you're going to have to pour large amounts of capital into any kind of heavy industry that is created insofar as it's against China's comparative advantage. That then means even if you want to create infrastructure, there's necessarily a trade-off with the amount of investment you're able to make when you have to actively trade off capital and invest it into subsidizing and propping up an industry that is against your comparative advantage. The second thing they tell you is on national protection and how this is going to be a lot better for you. But the first thing we would tell you is that heavy industry development is not the only way to ensure national defense, right? Like, you have strong military and infrastructure, such as like through strategic alliance through the Soviet Union and technological intervention. But secondarily, we would tell you that the kinds of machines they talk about on their side of the house are not going to be realized in the short term. What does that then mean? China, a country that has just gone out of 2 opium wars and the Sino-Japanese War, is uniquely in a position to be imperialized, to be invaded, particularly if Western countries think that you don't have the economic and military capacity in the short run to be able to survive on your own. That then means this is a time frame issue, because before you're actually able to get weapons, actually able to get military defense strategies, the West comes in, like they've done. They collapse your economy. Your foreign exchange is already fucked. They fuck this up even more. They never actually get to realize any of their impacts. But the third thing we would tell you is that you seem extremely hostile and aggressive, right? You risk alienating potential allies who see you as someone to partner with if you're actively creating huge military-industrial complex for you to be able to defend yourself. The fourth thing we would say, though, is that economic independence is the best way to signal to other countries that they cannot invade you, because first you build dependency if they depend on you as a trading partner, but second, like if you have large amounts of capital reserves, you incentivize foreign investment and you decrease the perception that like other countries are able to easily economically collapse you. The next thing they tell you is that the labor industry is unskilled. The first thing we would tell you is that it's not a question of skilled or unskilled, it's about labor intensity. What we tell you is that light industry requires a lot more people to be employed on our side of the house. That then means you're likely to employ a lot more unskilled people, therefore reducing the potentiality that peasants are going to revolt. The second thing we would tell you, though, is it's far easier to train someone on an assembly line, to train them in factory productions like you do in light industry, than it is for you to train them in heavy industry development, which requires things like chemicals and military defense knowledge. The third thing we tell you that they don't respond to is that heavy industry is a multi-stage commitment. That means even if you do have some kind of labor, it has to be labor that you can ensure can stay there for the next 20, 30 years. That means that a lot of people who need temporary employment are not employed on their side of the house. The next thing they tell you is that prices are going to go up. They never actually explain why this is going to happen. We say that prices go up on their side of the house in 3 ways. The first is we tell you the only way you can ensure profits in the short term for a lot of these heavy industry companies is by either increasing revenue, which you do by charging monopolistic prices and decreasing competition, therefore making things more expensive on their side of the house. The second thing you can do this is by decreasing costs, right? Because profit equals revenue plus cost. You do this by suppressing wages, like giving people low wages, suppressing input costs. That means like paying less for agricultural products so it costs less. That means that people get paid less on their side of the house, so things get comparatively more expensive as well. The third thing that we tell you though is that a large amount of goods on their side of the house are going to have to be imported because you're not producing them yourselves. But when you have to print a lot of fiat currency, because the only way you can purchase things is by artificially inflating your currency, that means things like everyday necessities like cars or food get way more expensive on their side of the house for the average citizen, because it costs way more for a Chinese person to buy corn than someone in like Eastern Europe, for example. They tell you that this looks like bad optics. They don't explain why. Like, we think this is completely compatible with the socialist ideology because you are prioritizing the masses and their ability to be fed before any other need, but secondarily because you can rationalize this under the umbrella of socialism, e.g. we're not supporting the entrepreneurs who want to create these large factories, we're doing things for you. The final thing they tell you is that they need to produce essentials. We tell you you're actually producing essentials because you're producing the kinds of foods and goods and products that are actually needed for the short term. They don't prove any of these solvencies. They say you don't have steel. We tell you you can just get steel from Russia. Very proud.
The member of government for eloquent remarks call upon the member of opposition to close out that's the constructive portion of the round.
Awesome. Okay. I will probably, whoever's charger this is, can I use it while I'm up here?
It's not mine, but
I think they're just up there.
yeah.
Oh, okay, that's not a charger then, probably plug in the projector. Okay. It's fine, I can plug it in.
You can use mine.
Worst case scenario, my laptop will die, but I grabbed paper closer. Okay. Oh my god, who's awake? Lots of sleeping in at this tournament. Okay. Pleasantries. I love giving pleasantries. I tend to make them very sappy. I don't think I can do this in this round because I will cry. Shyla, I love you so much. It is an honor to be at my last tournament ever with you. You are such an icon, you're so smart. You've taught me so much about so many important things. And made me feel really seen and understood in a way that I feel like any other, you're a very unique and wonderful person. Chicago, you guys are great. Again, it's awesome to partner with you, or to debate with you for the first time. I think this case is really awesome. It's really, really interesting. It's not something that I would rate, but it is like, the thing that I enjoy about debate is engaging with cases that aren't things I know anything about, that I can learn a lot about. In my speech, though, I do know everything that I say. Quick thank you to Naz. Also, I really appreciate you being here. Thank you guys for judging a lot. Seen you in the league for many years. Very much admire you guys as debaters and as judges now. Okay. Cool. The order is going to be. It's going to be off case then on case. Okay. Is anyone not ready? Awesome. First 5 answers on the USSR will just give you stuff, and or the USSR doesn't want you to do heavy industry because they're afraid of like competition fucking you over. 5 systemic reasons, I think, why other nations are probably in similar positions to you and probably cannot like buy your goods if you are producing consumer goods. Okay, 1. Just as we established, the West is not going to buy from you, and they say things like, oh, the West will not aggress against you because you can create dependence with them. I think that is just extraordinarily unlikely. I think that probably the United States is not going to buy a ton of communist Chinese-made goods. So here are the reasons why your trading partners, which are communist nations, probably cannot buy these goods from you, which means that you cannot make profit off of them. 5 things. 1, an ideological dedication to agriculturalism and or heavy industry stuff. I think this is probably true because lots of people are, invested in the project of literary study of communist theory and sort of the spread of the ideology of communism. 2nd, almost all of these are post-war nations because they had to fight some kind of revolutionary war in order to establish communism on their borders. A lot of them are post-colonial, etc. This means that a lot of their infrastructure was probably destroyed during that time, creates famines, creates inability to create leisure classes that can consume these types of goods. 3rd reason, 1, these are all lower developed countries in the first place because lower developed countries are more likely to turn to communism because they have the kinds of large peasant classes that are interested in doing Marxist revolution. I think it's very unlikely if you have a huge leisure class that is really highly employed that you're going to have a communist revolution in the first place and become a communist nation. 4thly, these had millions of losses in World War II. This is particularly true of Russia. They literally lost, I think, 10 million people in World War II. The rest of Eastern Europe is also really, really ransacked by this effort. Not to mention that you have lost a ton of people. I think it is very unlikely that they have huge coffers of, leisure classes that can buy things in the 5 years after the war. I think that's probably really bad. 6thly, I think that it is just false on your borders especially, right? They say that, the USSR was like, at the center of Eastern Europe and they're going to be at the center of a lot of these different trading networks, so they're probably the wealthiest nation in the communist world. 1, this is just not true in Eastern Russia. There's only one developed city, it is Vladivostok, it is in the peninsula, it is very hard to get to. You have to travel over large areas of Siberia to access it. These are things that you need, like very highly developed roads and railways, very good trains, and very good, at minimum, trucks to get to. I just don't think it is the case that they have large leisure classes in large swaths of Eastern Russia. Okay, secondarily, there's a lot of internal struggle in the USSR right now against, for example, things like Islam in Central Asia and different cultural traditions in Eastern Russia, which means that these are probably underdeveloped in comparison to Western Russia. They're probably underserved by the nation. They're probably not that interested in consuming a ton of your goods. This answers all of the Silk Road stuff because I think it's just unlikely that they can buy these kinds of things. Okay, what do they say? They say that the Cold War happened and that lots of people are just it was good for Russia to transition to heavy industry, but it's not good for you, and Russia will probably just give you all this stuff. 2 answers here. 1, I think it is true that the USSR has really high incentives to keep you up, right? To ensure that your country does not literally collapse. 1, global communist solidarity. 2, I think you have bonds against the Axis in World War III. 3, I think this is a stronger protection against the West in the long term. 4, you have a huge population and a huge area of landmass, plus a lot of unique resources that are all really good for the communist world to have access to. What does this mean? 2 things. 1, they're probably not going to undercut you heavily for fear of competition because 1, they still have a lot of development to do in Eastern Russia themselves and in Western Russia in the aftermath of World War I, so they probably need a lot of steel. It's not the case that you guys are competing because you're both just consuming so much fucking steel. Secondarily, they have very low incentives to tank your economy because they want you to be able to stand up in this communist regime and be able to like provide all the things that I told you in the first place. So, what do they think is going to happen? On the one hand, they tell you that, oh, Russia will just like give you tons of steel. This is probably not the case if they're interested in doing things like undercutting you for fear of competition. We think that the counterfactual, though, is that Russia does not have a lot of steel to give, nor is it very easy to get that steel over through Eastern Russia into your nation. What is the contrary then? We think that Russia, what they can give to you is lots of information sharing. We think that they can give you lots of information and blueprints on how to build these factories, on how to build these tanks, on how to build this different stuff, which means you have a huge boost in information. Everything that they tell you about why innovation is really, really hard is solved by this point because Russia has high incentives for you to be able to internally develop. On the contrary, though, they cannot buy these consumer goods. Two reasons here. One, I think there is a mismatch between the incentives of the USSR government and the USSR people. The USSR people are living in a famine. They have just survived World War II. They are underdeveloped, particularly in Eastern Russia. They do not have leisure classes that want to consume these kinds of goods, but the government has high incentives to give you some kind of influx of capital, at the very minimum influx of information in order to uphold you. I think it's more likely that the government can justify doing this kinds of actions as opposed to the leisure classes because in the communist nation there's probably a lot less money floating through the pockets of the people than it is to the pockets of the government. So what does this mean? Probably the impact is that the importation of consumer goods, very, very low, but however, them giving you some kind of influx of initial capital, probably very high influx of information, pretty much 100%. Okay. They say that China just like doesn't have any of these raw materials. I think this is just an assertion. I disagree. China's really fucking big. If you had mines before, you probably still have ore in those mines. It's probably not that high tech to get ore out of mines, things of that nature. You also, to be clear, agriculture is not a light industry product. Like processed agriculture is, but things like essentials like agriculture and maybe like basic cloth, etc., can probably still be done under our side of the house, but the important part is how you get these two different places. Okay. Let's go downstream. They say that political unity stuff is bad because you're going to seem hostile and like econ independence is going to be better. Crossplay what I told you, you're not going to get dependence from the West. The Soviets have no reason to invade you. I think that these are really all the important answers on case. They say that like the natural defense is best would be allegiance to the Soviet Union. I would agree. Okay, let's go on case. Okay. On the framing, most of what the framing tells you is pretty good. You want redistributive policies, and you want to have an apparatus of control. The ability to control is secondary to the ability to transit in between places. I think we win on this. Let's go on to investment. One, I think this is just false because all of their investment is path dependent on our investment, i.e. you still need steel and you still need factories in order to build a clothing factory, etc. in the first place. Secondly, I think you need more technology and more complex machines to do light industry, i.e. you need canning factories, you need things like, you need like sewing machines, etc. A lot of these, yes, can be converted into doing other kinds of goods in the long term, but this is unlikely given that you're probably not having that much innovation. And secondarily, I think it is more important that it is easier to produce things like raw materials that you can literally just construct buildings with in the first place. It's very unlikely that Russia is going to be able to unilaterally give you all of these goods, particularly as we've established that transit is so difficult through Eastern Russia. So they have to concede that they have to do our shit first, bare minimum, than doing their shit first. Secondarily, all of their stuff on how your currency is going to work is dependent on the ability to sell these goods. I think this is very unlikely. Two things. One, you can probably just use some amount of fiat spending and debt spending at the very beginning combined with the influx of capital that you're going to get with the USSR in order to have the upfront cost of building these factories and the technology to build these factories in the first place. Why is this not that bad? They say that the problem is if you have to have like tons of import-export imbalances, but the problem with this is that it is very unlikely that you're going to be exporting that much at all because the communist nations are probably just not having a lot of importations of particularly consumer goods, so trade is not that important in this round. Rather, what is important in this round is on-the-ground development. I think we're going to probably win. You need to do all of this stuff first. Okay. Secondarily, they say that like heavy, you have no tax base. I just think you're probably not taxing a lot of these people under either side of the house. I think in terms of essential goods, two answers. One, you can still do agriculture under our side of the house. It is easier to get at different places, easier to do those kinds of things. I think a lot of people still have like plots of land behind like their literal houses that they can do subsistence farming on. Secondarily, I think it is okay if a lot of these goods are publicly owned and publicly given out and distributed. I think this is how the system was working at the time, particularly in the USSR. So you're probably going to model after that. Most people are going to be providing goods literally by the government, so it doesn't matter if you have more inflation for luxury goods because you're still provided with bare minimum ability to survive. Next, I want to talk about labor. They say that it is really hard because you're going to have to set up labor for a really long time. Two answers on this. One, it probably means that people have more faith in these projects because they're very stable projects. Secondarily, I think people are more prepared for these kinds of projects because they can very clearly see the benefits of them, i.e. I built the steel and now my child gets to go to school because we have a new school in my building, i.e. I paved the roads, and that is really good because then the trucks that carry school teachers and carry books can come into these stations, the hospital trucks can come by. I think these are probably highly invested in these kinds of goods as opposed to highly invested in the kinds of goods that they definitely can't afford under their side of the house because they never explain how you're getting the startup capital to pay them high wages in the first place. Even if it's the case that you are typically paying higher wages for people who work in tertiary industries industries as opposed to people who work in primary industries. I think this is not the case inside of this particular context because all of these people are going to be employed by the government, which means that the competitive market for wages doesn't really apply, and probably we can just pay similar wages under either side of the house because we're going to have similar amounts of money to pay out. All the answers that they give you on FDI don't make any fucking sense because of the sanctions that you're going to be under for the global world. Okay, what do they tell you next? They say that there's more diverse goods that you're going to be easily able to switch. One, I think this is really false because two, it is dependent on all the corruption stuff. The corruption stuff is really, really bad under their side of the house because there's an inability to get people out into the provinces in order to check on these officials, which means that the corruption is going to run really, really rampant as opposed to the information sharing that is only possible if you have the roads.
Here. I think the member of opposition for the remarks and then call upon the leader of the opposition to close out the opposition side and open up the rebuttal phase of the debate. As usual, no new arguments, new examples are fine. Just to let y'all know, for both teams, for the point of order stuff, since this is a panel, we're taking everything under consideration. I would just like a brief, whoever's calling new to say what argument they're calling new, let the other team get a chance to say what's going on there, and we'll do the exchange of that.
Perfect. Alright. Are we good? First question is, can you even develop light industry? I don't think this necessarily is going to happen. Why? Developing light industry requires heavy industry. Why is this? You simply do not have the factories, roads, and ports. They say you can import it from the USSR. This does not respond to warrants that we explain. First of all, you can literally not import a road or a port. You have to develop that yourself. But second of all, you literally cannot trade physically. That is, I cannot import a lot of heavy machinery from the USSR if I literally do not have the machines at the ports to move that heavy machinery off the port, let alone take a lot of that back into the country. What does that mean then? This means that you cannot develop light industry because insofar as that requires to have a lot of factories that are currently destroyed, in addition to having the infrastructure to trade, you cannot develop light industry. You're not going to make any money off that. Next, also the idea of heavy industry is going to lead to infrastructure because they say that this is not true. I think that is false because first of all, you have to move the goods around. This is from LOC. In order to move the raw materials around to do these projects, you're going to have to build the roads. Second of all, you're producing the goods for a purpose. This is also from LOC. That is when you're literally producing the steel goes somewhere. This goes into infrastructure projects, etc. But third of all, I just don't think you can import a road or a port. So it doesn't make sense. Okay, it's more likely that the USSR, for the reasons it can provide you, is going to give you monetary capital, the machines. But even if that is not true, it is better that you get the monetary capital under our side because first of all, you can make more money in the future, or just because you can make more money in the future because the capital you can spend on what you want, which best helps your economy. Okay, I also think just on the labor thing, on the best cases is incredibly equal and assertive that one is easier than the other. We can come up with arguments all day about that. But I do think that it is physically easier to move stuff than to learn highly technical techniques to make textiles that are better than the other textiles that are being made in other countries. Doesn't necessarily make sense. Let's go on the short term. What's going to happen in the short term? Two things they don't really engage with. The first is that the political incentives. This is dropped. The only response they really, or I guess not dropped, the only response they really say is that the optics arguments make zero sense. That is not true. Let me explain to you the optics argument. That's first of all, you're having a communist revolution when you're creating capitalist goods for an upper class for other people to enjoy that looks like you are engaging in capitalism, which makes people angry. But second of all, you are literally doing things to help other people rather than help people in your country because the peasants don't need these luxury goods, but they also can't even afford them in the first place. So you only are focusing on other people rather than yourself. But even if you're not doing that, you have the perception of doing that. What does this mean? Three things. First of all, nobody is going to work on God because nobody's going to want to work in a factory where you do not have any, where you're just simply helping other people working against their own ideology. They're probably just going to instead do something else, like work in agriculture. Yes.
I think the argument that no one wants to work in a factory because they don't want to sew and make machines or something.
Let me find
I can point out literally where this is in LOC. It's under, so the first contention, development of the economy, the last subpoint is labor force. The last subpoint in that is that they'll be unmotivated.
Okay, well, each member of the panel will take it under consideration.
I think that's also somewhere in the second contention. I think I repeated it.
Oh yeah, the political benefit of the second contention is just that it, in the bad optics point, people are uninterested in these goods.
Okay, cool. Is everybody ready?
Yep.
This is also from LOC. I think that when you have people who are recently been in a revolution, and this also goes drop, that they're more likely to want to participate in another revolution, which means then that you have an existential threat to the CCP, because first of all, you're going to have no economic growth if nobody's going to want to work in these factories. You also don't employ more people if nobody wants to work in these factories. But second of all, I just think that's more likely that you're going to face another revolution where you're not doing things to help the people in the country, especially the people who did the revolution in the first place. Third of all, I just think this goes into a corruption argument that we explain in LOC and MO, especially in the MO. That is, you cannot check up on the factories when you don't have the roads to do so, which buys in all the corruption stuff. These are the political arguments that are going to be really bad and cause an existential threat for the CCP, which should be weighed highly. Okay, because we're a CCP actor, we don't want to die. Okay. Second thing under the long term is, do you end up making money? In the gut best case scenario, you're not going to have any profit because they don't necessarily approve a market. They're warned that you make money from trading as the USSR makes no sense, and this is respond to our warrant that the reason you don't have money is because you're spending a lot of money on other things, like you're like helping other people within your country, within the USSR. This is not responsive to that warrant, so our warrant still holds that you don't have anybody in the leisure class who's buying these goods. What does this mean? Best case scenario on Gov, you do all of this and you get the actual factories to do this, but you have zero profits. You have some roads and ports, but objectively less because you produce more than you trade because you care more about your own country than the USSR cares about you. But also, I think that you're just going to end up being in debt to the USSR for all these things. On top, we're going to get more intense infrastructure because we have more materials in which we are able to do so. That's beneficial. Third, what happens in the long term? They drop them when the communists win. What happens in the long term is super important. That is, you can trade with more people and you have a better economy yourself. You can trade anything you want. You can ship to anything you want. But at that point, if you don't have machinery and tools and roads and ports to do so, you literally cannot. That is, if I don't have the machinery to move something off of a ship or take in a bunch of ships at a time, I can't trade and I can't engage in economic growth. We're the only side that engages with the long term of the country. So if after the existential threats, you should look at the long term the most because this is how it affects the most amount of people and affects your country the most.
Thank the leader of opposition for her eloquent remarks. Call upon the Prime Minister to return and close out the government side and the rounds. No new arguments, but new responses to the new MO arguments are
Starting in. So, sorry, overview, it's going to be MO responses, an anti-ballot, and 2 ballots for Gov. Right.
Okay, whatever.
Yeah. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, some MO responses to why Russia actually has the incentives that we tell you they do. Firstly, they say they have an ideological incentive to invest in heavy machinery. This doesn't work because firstly, the ideologies of communist governments have not been shaped yet in 1949. We're shaping them as we do this, so whichever policy we choose will have ideological bias, as Helen points out. Secondly, they say that leisure classes don't want to buy these things. Firstly, Helen tells you that canned food and textiles are far less leisure goods than cars are and war machines are in the first place, right? The white elephant spending happens far more on their side of the house, and these goods are far less accessible on their side of the house. Thirdly, they said that Russia can't trade with you. Guys, Helen beat this in MG when she told you Russia has the infrastructure, they have the ships and they have the railroads to go for these things. Fourthly, Helen beats this by telling you that you already have the capacity to trade with these countries in the first place, right? You have existing trade routes like the Silk Route and existing ports which you've already traded with and have existing trade partners in the first place, making sure that they want light industry goods from you because that's what the Silk Road was made to do in the first place, which means you're already trading with these people, so you want to keep those trade relations to maintain your soft power on a global stage. What is the first anti-ballot? Their only argument that they say is that light industry requires heavy machinery as a prereq. We beat this argument by telling you the heavy machinery also requires heavy machinery as a prereq. In fact, it requires far more capital and heavy machinery as a prereq. There's 3 problems with this for them. This means that on either side, to get any industry over this on the top, you have to get Russia's support in the first place because they're the kinds of people who are likely to provide you the technical expertise and the capacity and the heavy machinery and the roads and the ships to be able to get this industry off the ground in the first place. On their side of the house, Russia doesn't have an incentive to share this information because it's bad for them. MO just asserts that there's going to be like some global power politics that they make sure that they sign these things. This just doesn't work in the context of this round because Russia is afraid of being out-competed, but secondly, Russia applies a pressure on you to transition to light industry in the first place because they want the comparative advantage of being able to produce the Go for it.
I think that it's new, and maybe this is paradigmatic as to what ability you can like generate new offense or generate new arcs off of MO stuff. I think it's new to say that Russia has the incentive to pressure you to do light industry specifically.
Right, this is like an MO response.
I think
It happens to be a turn, but like it is an MO response.
We'll take it under consideration individually.
Yeah.
Sorry, can you repeat what you're calling to?
Yeah, the argument that Russia will pressure you specifically into doing light industry.
I agree with you. I just think it's a response to MO, which is allowed.
I think that stuff about the USSR and how other nations are in similar places to you is in LO.
We'll take it into consideration.
This means that Russia uniquely shares information about one type of industry but not the other. And secondly, note that the other capacity you need for industries to start up is the raw materials for this industry. They completely cold drop the fact that China does not have the same amount of raw materials for heavy industry in the first place. They don't have access to steel mines and ore mines. The only response we get to MO is that you can go and mine ore, but you can't. It requires huge amounts of capacity to be able to do that in the first place, to be able to mine ore and to be able to transport it over long distances. On our side of the house, the raw materials for light industry are all over China. You have agricultural farms all over China which you can process into food industry. You have textiles being made in China all over the place, which means you can access all of those raw materials in the short run, which means you can do all of their case 20 years down the line when light industry has been actually developed to some extent and do these kinds of things. But secondly, the argument also becomes more likely on our side of the house because on our side, China has an incentive to make those roads in the first place. On their side of the house, the coastal elite capture China's things and don't make the roads to these small goods because there's no industrial value and economic value to those small goods. On our side, we give them economic value because we make them have light industry that is in and of itself capable on our side of the house, which means the roads have there's a capacity, there's not a capacity issue, there's an incentive issue for the CCP, which we are the only people who can solve in the first place. The first ballot there is just the existence of the CCP in the short run and why we have that. Firstly, they cold drop the argument about corruption, right? There's a lack of control over heavy industry because you can firstly never monitor these things, but secondly, these have huge, too big to fail problems in the first place, which means the people who run these become so politically important that they can cause splintering within the CCP and make sure that they can defect from you. You can never monitor these people, which means you lack the capacity to do so. The problem with monitoring is not like if you can get there or not, but rather if you can actually figure out what is happening in the first place, which means on their side of the house, you have huge amount of splintering happen within the CCP, which means it doesn't exist. Secondly, go for it.
I think all of that is new responses to LO, in which we said that you need roads to be able to check on corruption.
Firstly, I heard that in MO, but secondly, it's weighing between you need roads to do this, and we say you need to be able to understand what is going on to do this, and I'm saying that one is more important than the other in terms of ease of monitoring.
The only thing I'll add is where I said in LOC, so in LOC under the second argument, political benefits, the second thing under that is this entire farming class of regional evolution. The second thing under that is also uniting the nation with roads, unites the nation, and then the third, fourth thing under that is more ability to check on productivity of the nation because you have the roads.
Gotcha. We'll take it under consideration individually.
Thank you.
Okay. The second thing is under the where you give these jobs in the first place, right? We told you light industry can be set up anywhere because of the lack of, the amount of raw materials are available anywhere and the skilled labor it is required is far less. On their side, heavy industry is only set up in the coastal regions, meaning the coastal, regional internal divide happens far more on their side of the house. Thirdly, how many jobs are available, right? We don't care.
I'm sorry, maybe I missed this. I'm sorry to call so many. I think that the argument that you can only set these up in coasts is new. I think that we have at the beginning that the inner places are where you're going to set lots of factories.
Sorry, in PMC the argument is you can set them, the vast majority, I said all now, if you want to
Okay, maybe I missed it.
strike that vast majority, I'll tell you where it is in PMC. Increased proximity to innovation, spread improvements all across China. It's in subpoint A.
It's subpoint B.
Subpoint B, okay, yeah. It's at the bottom of subpoint A and in subpoint B. And also in MG probably. I'm sure it's under consideration.
Yeah.
Okay.
Consideration.
Thirdly, they don't meet the warrant of how many jobs exist, right? We told you that in heavy industry, the number of jobs that exist are far fewer because furnaces and other large machines do vast majority of the jobs. This means that the number of jobs they can provide is drastically lesser on their side of the house, which means people are unemployed, and this makes them far more likely to revolt than any other sort of they don't like the employment in the first place or any of those kind of things. But secondly, we told you it requires far less skill to have heavy industry. They call all of this assertions, but it's not assertions. You have to operate machines on both sides of the house, but on our side, the machines are far more sophisticated and far harder to understand, which means you're more likely to get it on our side of the house. Lastly, they say ideologically you're likely to do heavy industry. Helen beats this because firstly, you're able to put goods that the Communist Party is producing in every single person's house. No one gets the benefits of steel in industry. Unlike this thing, they don't get just magically get schools coming up. You don't see the benefits of steel because they're built in ports as they themselves concede. On our side, the goods are seen in every single person's house, which means they see the CCP doing good things for them. You're able to say that the CCP is caring about its people and giving them goods and services that everyday people care about, such as finished products like bread, which are very much on our side of the house because you have to process grain to get bread on our side. But secondly, on economic superiority and how we do that. Firstly, become nationally independent, which is both ideologically valuable because you can say that you're self-sufficient, but secondly, that it's also security reasons valuable because you're less likely to be invaded and more resilient to invasions if they happen if you're nationally independent. But secondly, you have a Russia versus China comparative advantage on our side of the house, where you're able to import heavy industry from Russia and give them light industry. The only response is that Russia doesn't have the capacity to consume light industry, but this doesn't matter because firstly, these goods are not the kinds of luxury goods that they present in the first place. They are things like food and textiles on our side of the house, which means Russia does want these things. But secondly, even if it doesn't matter, it's a comparative argument that they want light industry more than they want heavy industry, which they already have a lot of. And lastly, we increase the productivity of existing industries such as agriculture. Proud to propose.
Here, I thank both teams for an excellent round. I encourage everybody to not shake hands and we're supposed to express their support for one another and happiness.
Are we waiting outside or in GA?
Let's just wait in GA. We'll be sending the results over. I don't want to, they may be one of the later ones and whatever, they might have